Well, thanks. Silent applause is actually the only kind I'm accustomed to. I think that I've got things working here, but obviously, someone tell me if I'm not. I feel like suddenly everything I do is like my parents on a Zoom call, and my parents aren't very good at Zoom calls, but I think we've got things going here. Friends, hi. This talk is a provocation, a suggestion that maybe some of the closely held assumptions and habits that we have aren't serving us very well or our users. But before getting to all that provoking, I want to start with a little bit of kindness and commiseration. This has been quite a year, huh? 2020. I hope all of you are hanging in there and healthy, and I know that all of you are doing the best that you can. You deserve a vacation. And thing is, of course, with vacations is most of us haven't been able to travel much this year. So I'd like to start by indulging in a little virtual travel together. So friends, let's go to Spain. Specifically, let's go to a little town called Borja in northeastern Spain. And in particular, there's one special place that I'd like to take you. It's this little chapel, the Sanctuary of Mercy in Borja, Spain. Really, really lovely, right? And if you look at that little red circle in the bottom right, that's where you'll find a remarkable artwork. It's a fresco that's modestly placed, really, on that column. And it's titled Ecce Homo. That's Latin for Behold the Man. And this is how the fresco looked about 10 years ago, obviously distressed, in need of restoration. And so in 2012, an amateur restorer took a crack at bringing it back. And friends, the result was really something. Yeah. Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, started to be called Ecce Mono, Behold the Monkey. And oh, so many people beheld it. It was an internet sensation and a tourist boom, it turned out, for the church. People from all over the world came to look at the botched restoration, sort of selfie central, people getting their picture with it. A monkey Mona Lisa, some people called it. And in fact, it inspired an actual monkey Mona Lisa. Yeah, a scream indeed, right? And these weren't the only reimagined artworks that came out of there. It was Ecce Mono everywhere. The monkey with the pearl necklace at lower left, the last monkey at top right. And so, everybody was getting in on the meme. Happy trees, no longer satisfied Bob Ross. Okay, well, so why I bring this up? My friend and collaborator, Brad Frost, often jokes that this is the way the design and development process works, at least in designers' eyes. So designers sweat over their beautiful comps and mockups that detail exactly how something should look and how it should work. And then developers hash through it and they deliver this, right? Yeah. Despite all the research, all the wireframes, all the carefully crafted comps, this is the result we get in designers' eyes. And now this is not a ding on developers. Often designers spend months, frankly, diddling with our comps and leaving developers with just this tiny fraction of time at the end. I think what I want to remind us all of is that the only thing that matters at the end of the day is what comes out the other end. All that planning and all those comps and all those wireframes, they don't matter if they're not reflected in the product. And it's rare that all those details actually are reflected in the product. So I suggest that as an industry, as a craft, we're doing it wrong. At the end of the day, only one deliverable matters. Only one artifact matters. Only one milestone matters. It's the product. The goal of our work is not to make comps and mockups. The goal of our work is not to make wireframes. The goal as a team is to make a product. So I have to tell you a secret, and I'm a little uncomfortable, I admit, saying this out loud as a designer. So developers, please cover your ears. I don't want you to hear me say this, but the developer is the thing, right? It's all about the developer. Let this idea sink in. There's only one role that's strictly necessary to get a software product made, the developer. That's from Dan Mall, who is a designer, right? We heard from Dan at the top of the show, of course, and Dan and I see eye to eye on most things. We've worked on a ton of projects together. I'll share a couple of them today. It's hard to argue his point that the developer is the linchpin of the whole project. Software literally can't be delivered without a developer. And yet all too often, It's the developers who are left with miserable scraps of time at the end of a project to actually get the thing done, while we designers burn time with comp after comp after comp. And that's screwed up. We're screwing over the one person who actually needs to do the work. You know, what's worse, as Dan said earlier today, designers barely talk to developers in a lot of organizations. I've run into some of the organizations that I work with through my agency, Big Medium, where the designers rarely have any input with developers. They just sort of throw their designs over the wall, sort of as pictured here, and that's it. Dan suggests that the question designers have to ask is, how can I be of service? Or developer, how can I help you? How can we get to code quickly? This conversation can be just as effective in many cases as elaborate documentation and design comps. And I want to be clear here, I don't mean that good planning and thinking aren't necessary. I think that comps and mockups are important. I just think we spend too much time in there. So just to be really clear, good planning and thinking are totally necessary. Let's do lots of good thinking. Let's do designing. I just think that we're lingering too long in the wrong place when we do that thinking. We have all these deliverables and artifacts as designers, and too many designers get precious about those documents. I know I've been guilty of it, and I still am. We're all trapped inside our own workflows and inside our own media and tools, and we don't collaborate because often we're focused on fine-tuning our specific corner of that planning. So first, the UX designer sweats over a detailed wireframe. So that's sort of one version of the software, of the product. Then the UI designer replaces the wireframe with a detailed comp, and then usually another one, and another one, and another one. And then the interaction designer replaces those comps, maybe with a full-blown motion prototype. And we've built all these versions of the site and then thrown them all out. And we haven't even created a single line of software yet. You know what that means? It means that our industry builds generations of carefully crafted, disposable facsimiles of software before even writing a line of code. And here's a hard truth. In the long run, those design artifacts are unimportant. Only one deliverable matters, the product itself. Everything else gets thrown away when you ship, which sort of suggests that there's a lot of waste of time and effort and resources and human creativity, your human creativity. And how we got here, frankly, is because of agencies. And I say this as someone who runs an agency. The workflow of modern digital design emerged from agency work. Back in the day, pretty much every company hired agencies to do all the digital stuff. There wasn't an in-house kind of culture. But the folks writing those contracts with those agencies then and now only wanted to pay when agencies gave them something, deliverables. We have to see something for the work. So as a matter of cash flow, agencies had to invent stuff to deliver over the course of the project. And you can kind of see in the room how this might have happened is, I don't know, maybe we could get them to pay if we give them our sketches. Let's call it a wireframe deliverable, cha-ching, right? We could give them our journey map, cha-ching. So all of these informal exploration artifacts suddenly became deliverables themselves. They grew in time and attention because agencies needed them to get paid. It was a matter of necessity. And so the industry then absorbed that mindset. But those things were only supposed to be ephemeral, just sort of devices for exploration and thinking to figure out what to do next. Our team's job is to make software, not pictures of software. Yet over and over again, we're drawing what amount to sort of aspirational watercolors of imagined interfaces. Working software over comprehensive documentation is one of the core principles behind Agile projects. This is from the Agile Manifesto. And I want to say, it doesn't say no documentation. It doesn't say comprehensive documentation isn't important, but it expresses a preference. Given the option, prefer working software over comprehensive documentation. Another way of putting that is show, don't tell, make instead of document. Wireframes and comps and prototypes, all those things are documentation. And I want to be clear again, I don't mean don't do documentation or don't do sketches. Again, that planning is super important. Research, design, thoughtful planning, so important to a successful project. I just believe we're doing it in the wrong place. Now, I say this as a designer. We designers are being precious a lot of times, overly focused on fine-tuning our artifacts in ways that aren't serving the user because they aren't serving the developer. Instead, I think we can do as little as you need to do to get smart ideas into working code. There's this long-standing principle in software engineering called the principle of least power. And it's the idea that developers should choose the least powerful programming language suitable for a given purpose. So put another way, it sort of encourages the developer to ask, what's the most expressive thing that I can do with the least complexity? So less powerful programming languages tend to be both more expressive and less complex. So if you don't need the power, lean into something that is more expressive, less complex. It's easier for you to get your ideas out. And this is the way the developer community might describe the principle of least power. The corollary for designers is, what's the least I can do to communicate what should be done next? How do I give the developer enough information that they will build the correct thing, or to have a good conversation about what the correct thing is? So what the good news that I'm saying is for designers, you can do better by doing less. We need fewer comps, fewer wireframes, fewer high-fidelity pieces of documentation. Again, I want to be super clear here. Keep doing your planning, keep doing your thinking, but save the high polish for the product itself. What if we reversed the time that we spent, in other words? What if design settles for lo-fi and then the high fidelity work happens at the point of production? And I know, designers, I don't either. I don't want to be making monkey man comps, but isn't this the direction things should go? Constant refinement and improvement instead of regressing in the other direction? So I've got a few ideas about how we might get there, sort of 5 concepts, 5 suggestions, and I'm going to walk through all of these with you here. The first concept is words over wireframes, conversation instead of documentation, or in preference to, as the Agile Manifesto might say. I love this quote from my friend Derek Featherstone, the accessibility advocate. The core value of the wireframe is in the conversation, not in the boxes. The original spirit of wireframes and journey maps and comps and the like, as I mentioned earlier, was for exploration, to communicate ideas efficiently. That began as devices for conversation and for experimentation. And in that loose context, they still remain, as useful as ever. Over time, as I mentioned, though, that process calcified and artifacts became shrines. And as I've said, these sketches became milestones and deliverables. If it's about the conversation, as Derek suggests here, maybe we don't even need the boxes in the first place. I was thinking about when I first started setting aside wireframes as a polished deliverable, and I realized it was way back in 2014 when I led the design of O'Reilly Media's website. Dan Mall was the art director for the project. We've worked on a lot of stuff over the years together. Let's go back to those halcyon days of 2014, shall we, and talk about how that project influenced my work to this day. This is Jennifer Brooke, and it was Jennifer who kind of opened my eyes to an alternative to wireframing. Jennifer was our interaction designer on the project. Most recently, she was a research lead at Dropbox. She's definitely just one of the smartest people I know. And she showed me this hot new design tool, friends, called a spreadsheet. And this is a detail of her content recommendation for the ideas channel landing page for the O'Reilly website. And from top to bottom, this is the order of elements on the page, or organisms, as we had already begun using kind of atomic design parlance. And we have some description of each there, sort of what each thing is doing, what's happening in each organism, each element. But let's just squint at that first column a little bit. When you look at that, wait a second, that's basically a mobile wireframe, right? In fact, let's compare it to another project that we did in that era with mobile wireframes for Entertainment Weekly. And that's, boy, pretty similar kind of thing. Admittedly, we'd blow it out into a bit more detail there. But it turned out that, when Jennifer kind of arrived at that version on the left, she was like, you know what, that's enough. My responsibility here is done. The whole intention of wireframes is to put the focus on content hierarchy instead of visual design. But the very fact that they often embed layout kind of undercuts that mission. And Jennifer said, if I start drawing little boxes and arrows and layout, that begins to force the hand and set expectations of the UI designer. And Dan was like, yeah, I don't want that either. I want to have those ideas. I've got better ideas than you do, Jennifer, on that. And Jennifer said, yes, you do. So we stopped there. And the result is effectively that plain text became the wireframe. It's a simple plain text bullet list of content in order of priority. And that's a great conversation to have. Then we can sort of say, are these the right things? Are they in the right order? So if you can get the conversation without that detailed wireframe, then do it. No need to keep on going after that. So I've since sort of supplemented this simple text list with a brief mission statement for the page. This is work that's informed by customer and stakeholder research, and it puts an implicit focus on the jobs that this page has to do to become more explicit about its goals and outcomes. So I sort of supplement what you see here in this original spreadsheet with a list of mindsets that users bring to these pages, tasks that users can complete on this page, that they need to complete on the page, goals that the page have to fulfill for the organization. Why does this page even exist as far as the organization is concerned? Now we have a discussion document that sets out the content of the page along with the priority and function, kind of the existential job for each element, all in plain text. And this simple prioritized list of content turns out to be a valuable discussion piece. The focus is not only on what to make, but why and to what end. What is the job of each one of those components and how do we design to it rather than just sort of here's a set of boxes to ape in our design. So what's next after that? Well, we can skip the wireframe and go straight into comps, and specifically mobile comps, small screen comps. So again, remember, we already have our basic wireframe here. And with this, I don't want to sort of say that we aren't doing any work in between this and the comp. We still sketch loosely on whiteboards or on paper to see how this might lay out. We figure some stuff out informally, but then quickly we go to here. And you can see how this maps to our spreadsheet's organisms here, right? We've got the header navigation and featured block, which continues down to here. We've got this next section of sort of four things, and we've got latest stuff, best of, we've got this contributors block. And I want to note, the big argument in general for wireframes instead of comps is that we don't want to distract from hierarchy decisions with the visual look before getting into the brand, that people can't handle that. But we already had that hierarchy decision with the spreadsheet, and layouts, frankly, are not complex for small screens. So essentially what we can do is we've got the content, we know what that's going to be. Are we getting the brand presentation right in a very simple layout? Does this feel right? So we can explore traditional wireframe decisions in the comp itself. And if you think about what's happening here, what we're really doing is we're pushing production downstream, which is the third element, I think, that we can do in sort of putting that final deliverable, the product, first. Instead of doing a wireframe, in other words, I kick it over to the visual designer, the UI designer, to just build out the mobile comp. But we can kick it even further downstream to the front-end developer. In fact, a design system speeds this along even before we have the formal components done, because we know we will have components. We've already named them on our spreadsheet. So we can even start just by stubbing them out in the browser. And even if we have, frankly, so if we have a design system, great, we can actually even chuck those components right in. We're already halfway there. This looks a lot like our spreadsheet / mobile wireframe too, right? It's something that's just kind of, here are these blocks. So in fact, we're almost pushing the wireframe already into the browser, sort of leapfrogging a few different sort of traditional steps. So instead of doing this, where we have sort of a linear flow of text to comp to browser, we're simultaneously doing this, which means that as soon as our mobile comps are like, yeah, 70% there, close enough, we can shift that design straight into the browser where we've already got the wireframe stubbed out and go right into sort of production. So very quickly, we're able to go from that comp that I was showing you, when we have sort of pretty good confidence that we're in the right area, to going into looking at the rendered markup here in small screen. So as we look at this here, we can see it's like, oh, this is, it's showing all the sort of essential styles that were present in that initial comp. And we're able to kind of see how it works. And we can refine from here, where frankly, a lot of the content changes are going to be faster to make in HTML and markup than it is going to be in a static sketch tool. But we can also sort of see how it works at wider widths. And you can see that the developer, has made a few layout decisions to make it kind of work, but it feels a little rough, right? These aren't a bad stab, but it's a little bit clunky still. So now we can bring the designer back into the mix. And so over time, we can get to this view in Markup. It still needs a little work. We aren't feeling great about that sidebar at the right, maybe. So Dan comes in and does some spot comps on that specific area, not sort of redoing or relaying out the whole page, but it's like, let's fix the part that feels broken, just that section, and looking at how maybe it changes that features area as well. And we get this shift. So we're ping-ponging now between design and development, what Dan earlier today called the hot potato process. Where can we do our thinking and make decisions fastest? Is it the designer or the developer? Is it in the browser or is it in Sketch? And what's interesting here is that the discussion focuses on individual portions of the page, individual components of the page. We've got the whole page in Markup already. And then we have design comps and interventions at small focused areas of the page as needed, which really means that by focusing on components at that level, it means that we can spend more time on the product itself. Instead of churning on full page comps, we're working and refining that front end markup instead of disposable static comps. And over time, a common vocabulary emerges between designer and developer because they're working together on details of the site. You have names and symbols that translate to working code in your product. So in other words, this is sort of the opportunity, is doing less production work and more collaboration in the product itself, in the code. Let the project timeline spend more time in code and less time in Sketch or Figma or InVision or whatever your preferred tool is. Which brings us to the fourth thing that I want to talk about, is code commits over red lines, over those little sort of corrections that sort of be like, no, we've got to adjust the code, the markup this way because the spacing isn't quite right over here, and the, all those little sort of sizing and ratio corrections that make both designers and developers crazy. So code commits over red lines. And yeah, I know what some of you are thinking. Oh man, please Lord, not this again, right? And don't worry, I'm not getting into this. I'm not making that argument. I'm sort of indifferent to it. But I do think that there's an opportunity for designers to gain by doing a little bit of code-ish work. And there can be gains in both designer productivity and better collaboration and communication with developers. Our tools look different, of course, between designers and developers. But UI designers and developers can both think about certain aspects of a UI in the same way. Both already think about assigning attributes or properties to UI objects. So here's a card in Sketch, and if we inspect this text element, we can see those properties. We have the typeface here, and we have the font size and the character spacing. Let's go ahead and open that up a little bit. Yeah, that feels a little better. And maybe we can transform the text to be all uppercase, right? And all of those properties, of course, have their corollary in code, or in this case, in CSS. So let's grab those CSS attributes. And we see the CSS declarations that you could use to describe that text. So designers might be using sort of the controls in Sketch. Front-end developers, of course, would be using these declarations, a one-to-one mapping, really, for the styles that we've established in Sketch. And the CSS style sheet for that kicker element might then look something like this. So right off the bat, I can tell you that developers would appreciate getting documentation like this much more than a marked up redline comp. So much easier to implement and translate. It's a copy and paste. But we can go one better than that when we abstract that a level higher and start using design tokens. Design tokens are basically variables that describe those same properties or attributes. So they're considered at this point kind of a fundamental part of any design system. If you're not familiar with design tokens, they're an idea that have been around for a few years now. The concept came from Gina Ann during her years crafting the Salesforce design system. You create these variables, and then you flow them through to your various platforms, to CSS, to iOS, to Android, whatever you're using, so that all projects and platforms can share the same colors and spacing and border radius, et cetera. You get good consistency organization-wide, which is one of the reasons for a design system in the first place, right? So here you can see what those tokens might look like to describe that kicker element in detail. More often, though, you begin by describing broader brand attributes. So we have the fonts that the brand uses, or the brand colors. These are things that typically get stashed maybe in a PDF for a brand book, right? The sort of this document that designers are expected to pore over to understand all of the different sort of spacing considerations around a logo or the brand colors. Instead, designers and developers can document them in code where they're actually closer to the product and have less of a chance of sort of slipping out of sync. So let's zero in on these two, though, the tokens for Helvetica and 50% gray. Both of those are used in our kicker here for the font family and for the color. So we could actually just replace those kicker values with the design tokens, right? And then we've just got those things now referencing the tokens. And if we take that forward, we could add a middle tier of design tokens that describe roles, the size and line height for body text maybe, and then bring those into the kicker properties too. So by doing this, we're encouraging system thinking too, right? Reuse of a carefully defined set of values. So when you create a new UI element and you don't use one of those design tokens to describe an attribute, that should sort of have a bad smell for you, right? It brings a bit of discipline to our work, a thoughtfully constrained palette that's sort of saying, oh, wait a second, I'm doing something new. Is that really warranted, or should I rethink and go back to this other set of defined values, whether those are, kind of brand values like we saw earlier, or some of these things that are more sort of component specific perhaps. But also, when we think in terms of tokens, it means that designers can deliver work in ways that are most easily absorbed by developers, that can flow right into their code. But it can also help make designers' work easier and more productive too. Let me show you what I mean. Let's come back to Sketch. That's a Sketch window on the right with obviously sort of a button in there. Let's see if we can apply tokens to design tools, not just code. So here we've got a simple button, and this button's background fill uses a layer style in Sketch. The layer style name is normal in the button primary category. So you could say its name is button primary normal, though perhaps it makes more sense backward. It's a normal primary button, right? But if we're going to describe that style in CSS, we could do it like you see here. The background color is black. Now, say that we could actually change the look of Sketch in CSS. Well, we could do it like so. Whoa, okay, wait, what happened there, right? So I've been contributing code for the last few months to a Sketch plugin called Puzzle Tokens, and it lets you update Sketch layers and library symbols using style sheets in CSS or Sass or less. You point the plugin to the style sheet, which is the one you see here, and the Sketch file just falls in line. So let's change our button a bit more by updating that fill style. And we also have a text layer that has the same name. So let's describe the text we want. Little Comic Sans, never hurt anyone, am I right? So we can also control our button padding and sizing. We'll do this with margin here, which is not how you would do it on the web, but Sketch needs us to do it this way. The plugin adds a few special properties. Here we're saying we want to set the margin relative to the button's fill layer. So effectively, we're spacing the text layer relative to its background and resizing the background layer to fit. Effect is the same as button padding. And finally, we'll also style the symbol itself, which is named button primary. And put that in. Yeah, see, that's a button primary symbol right there. And we'll use a few custom properties to help the symbol resize when we do things like change font size. That's what's going on there. So let's run those styles through Sketch. Oh, yes. Beautiful button. Best button ever. OK, so because this is a Sketch symbol that we're styling, we can add more instances of that symbol like so. Let's type into it, and you can see it adapts nicely and resizes as we type. So just as before, we can change the text styles. Let's go ahead and embiggen that text. See what we get. Yes. Nice jumbo buttons. That's pretty cool. So we can programmatically control our Sketch library with CSS. And OK, so far that might seem like maybe a neat parlor trick, but not that useful. Let's see why this matters by getting back to this idea of design tokens. If we put tokens like this, Sass variables in, then we could write a style sheet to control our Sketch library entirely using those design tokens. So you can see that the background color is now using the button background design token, right? Which shows up here as a Sass variable. All the relevant properties are using tokens. Let's process the Sketch file and see how it works. Yeah, and of course, we can now update the Sketch file just by updating a design token. So let's make that border style red. Yeah, so now designers can collaborate with developers and it means that we can use tokens to automate and distribute design changes, not only to production code, but to design tools too. Instead of endlessly going over red lines, now we can work together by providing those token values. They plug directly into the production code and then updates both code and design tool, keeping everything in sync. Pretty cool, huh? Kind of magic. Let's think about how that scales with more complexity and how that changes our work. I've been working this summer with a giant company that has hundreds of consumer brands, and I've been helping them create a system of design systems, a single set of core components in Code and Sketch and Figma, all completely customizable for each of those hundreds of brands through a design token theming engine. So here's a snippet of that work. This is a sketch library that has all the components defined. It's neutral by design. It doesn't look like much, right? This is just the base that we use for all of our brands. And then we customize them by applying our styles. So, it has cards and accordions and buttons and all the workaday components the company needs. And here we have a few different button instances, 2 kinds of buttons in different states. These are controlled by our design tokens here. And by creating a more sophisticated SAS style sheet for our buttons, we can start doing things like using tokens to add icons to our buttons. So we can put in here just next for the next icon. Now this token is going to affect this button at top left, so keep an eye on that. We'll apply those changes. And there's our next button. Or we can use the tokens to change to a different icon. So let's have a profile icon. We'll apply those changes. Yeah, there we go. Or here's what happens when we switch to a whole different brand using a whole new set of tokens. I'm going to point to a new SAS style sheet. So just style the same components in Sketch, and look at that. Now we have border radius on the buttons, and a box shadow on the buttons, and a gradient on the borders at left, and a gradient on the backgrounds at right. So what we have here, right, is tons of visual flexibility, something that we typically associate with code, but not so much with design tools, but all controlled by these token settings and reflected immediately in both the product code and the design tool. So let's consider what we've done here. We've created a single set of core UI components and code that are styled by design tokens. Designers and developers work together to define those for each brand, and that gives each brand its own custom design system, including a custom sketch library whose components always match the look and feel of the code. So designers can create new layouts using the system components styled precisely for the brand that they're working on. If there's a change, we push out the library, and designers are always up to date, and developers look at it and like, yep, this matches what I have in code. So now, whether designers are actually writing those tokens and committing to a code repo, or if they're just informally supplying those token values to developers, it's not really that important. It depends on your process, personal preference, comfort level. The point is not really about coding. Here's the important bit. The product becomes the common workspace. We're actually shifting our work forward into the product, not just drawing pictures of it. The problem with drawing pictures of software rather than actually working in the software is that design comps drift from the realities of the established patterns in the code base, and that causes confusion. Developers are like, oh, I guess I've got to make a variation in this, when it was really just, frankly, an error because the designers weren't up to date with what the latest standards were. So I want to remind you of that question that we had, is what's the least I can do to communicate, and what should be done next? When you're maintaining and evolving a product, this wonderful blank canvas is actually a dangerous thing. It invites us to build anything. It's great for blue sky thinking. It's terrible for designing within constraints or designing within an established system. And what that means is that the thing that you draw here is something you're inventing, out of the blue. A library in Sketch or Figma or InVision or any collection of drawings of software can be a canonical UI reference only when the design is first conceived. When the design gets into code, the product itself has to be the reference, and fresh design has to work on top of that foundation, which means that the code has to be the source of truth. All that matters is what's in the code. It's more important that our design libraries reflect what's in the code than the reverse. Production code and the UI it generates has to be the single source of truth. Or, seriously, madness ensues. So a good design system recognizes that truth is in the component library. and then broadcasts and shares that into all the tools and documentation for everyone on the team. So what I've tried to show is there's sort of an opportunity to cook the design system into your favorite tool. That was one way we did it in this organization that really favors Sketch, and Sketch was the baseline. There are other possibilities, though, that are emerging here. Let me show you an example that's coming out of UXPen, a forthcoming feature that's now being tested there. UXPen, if you're not familiar with it, is a design tool. And what I'll show you here is UXPen syncing with a React library and bringing those rendered components right into the design tool that you can actually interact with them as live code. So here's a card component that we can drag in this case. We'll search for the card component, bring it right in. And we obviously want to do more with that. So let's add an image to the card, bring in a status element. And these are actual React elements rendered by React in the design tool. And otherwise, behave sort of like a Sketch or InVision or Figma. But these are actual working images, working components here. And we can reorder them, so we can put the image a little bit higher up toward the top. So far, this feels a lot like a typical design tool. But again, these are actual React elements. So they surface the props in React here on the right. So you can actually sort of toggle and adjust those things, almost like overrides in Sketch. But this is actual working code. So you can see how it will actually behave. And it's the responsive elements, too. So as you drag them, they change just as the code does. So for the design elements that are already settled, already created, designers can just drop them in, and it will always look like what developers have. No muss, no fuss. We're just like literally designing with live coded elements. It's one of my favorite principles of design systems, and really of just design process, is that when you make something part of your everyday tool, it's the path of least resistance. This is the promise of a design system, making it easy to get the obvious stuff, easy to do the right thing, make the boring stuff so easy so you don't have to think about them anymore. The problem's already been solved. This is why you'll find that pretty much all high-performing teams have design systems. They've optimized away the settled problems for both designers and developers. So it's easy for them to do the right thing. So while this is true, though, I want to caution you that design systems don't make high-performing teams. This is because high-performing teams need more than components. A great design system is more than a kit of parts. It's a platform for collaboration. It's a repository for institutional knowledge. So it's only as successful as you are at collaboration, at sharing institutional knowledge. But also, it's a shared vocabulary of settled solutions for how the organization gets certain things done. So one way to look at it is that a healthy system is a sign that the team is in sync, that the team is healthy. And a healthy team is a team that trusts each other. Which brings me to the last thing that I want to mention today, which is that we have to cultivate trust outside of documentation. If you think about why we document things, it's because we don't trust our colleagues to know how to do the right thing, or frankly ourselves in a few years, maybe, right? It's not necessarily a knock. It's like you don't know what to do, or you don't have enough information. And so we still need documentation. But my point with all of this so far is that maybe we need a different kind of documentation, a lighter documentation, something that is more product forward. We often create more than we need, or frankly, than ever will be looked at. We bury people in so much documentation that it actually becomes useless and nobody consults it. So document what must be documented, but realize that really what we're trying to do is communicate information quickly. And we can do that with much lower fidelity exercises than the high fidelity documents that we tend to create. Keep doing that thinking. But remember that comps and sketches are tools for exploration, for thinking and conversation. They are useful. There's no doubt about it. But they're also about pushing things forward, not being complete. Somewhere along the way, these thinking tools that were originally used for exploring ideas became an end in themselves, and they are not the deliverables that matter. Let's use them, but let's use them properly and with much more reserve to inform a focus on the product. Let's talk to each other more. Let's ask the developer what they need. Let's collaborate more so that we can get the best ideas. It's not about tools and technology. It's about people and process and organization and greater goals. Dan called this the hot potato process. I call it the glorious churn of collaborative work and everything that can kind of come out of more collaboration, not less. Designers and developers trading ideas to make the best possible product. So friends, 5 modest suggestions in sort of a provocative notion that maybe we're approaching our carefully held artifacts and creations a little bit too closely. In presenting these to you, though, I also want to acknowledge I have never built a website the same way twice. So I'm not trying to suggest a rigid formula or process, really the opposite. I'm suggesting that you can be flexible in the tools you use. Use the right tool in the situation for who you're trying to communicate with, the thinking that you need to do. Use whatever lets you do your best thinking in the fastest way and to communicate it the most expressively. And that lets you ask and answer this question the most effectively. Returning to Dan's idea, developer, what do you need? How can I be of service to the developer and to the product and to the designers who are going to follow me? If you're interested in digging into all this further, I wrote it up in this article, which you can find on my agency's website, bigmedium.com. And speaking of which, this is what we do. We work with organizations to create and imagine remarkable projects, design systems for sure, but also projects around artificial intelligence and connected devices and more. And so if this stuff seems interesting to you, if we can help, feel free to reach out to me at bigmedium.com. And with that, thank you for being awesome.
There he is.
Hello, Phil.
Sorry to keep you hanging on. Thanks so much for putting in the time to indulge us in some questions and answers as well. It's very much appreciated.
I am happy to do it. And well done to you, Phil. This stuff is always deceptively hard to MC. And I think here we are in a very strange environment to be doing things in. It's
thank
you.
A
new environment, the always on environment. But you're doing great.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very kind of you to say. Yes, it is a little unusual, but thankfully, the Smashing team is amazing. So there are lots of Smashing pixies running around making this all work. So, but yeah, it is
to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit unusual for everyone, but it's working out just fine. There were some questions that were in the chat that I might throw your way if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
The first one might be a simple one that we'll just mop up along the way, because I think people were their curiosity was very piqued by the puzzle tokens and that project you've been contributing to. And there was a question about does that exist for Figma? Is there something like that for Figma as well? That might be completely outside of what you're aware of, but do you know?
I know that the crew, look, first of all, Figma does a great job at sort of like being kind of connected to other stuff. And so I haven't seen something that is precisely like puzzle tokens for Figma, but we have made some good progress in making Figma play nice with design tokens, but there aren't necessarily as much kind of out of the box things as there are there. I do know that the crew behind puzzle tokens is working on something for Figma, so stay tuned.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, we all want exactly the right thing for the tool that we're using right now, and there's so many of them. So it's not really surprising. I have to say, I just adored the expression "save the polish for the product itself." Oh, I wish I'd had that in my arsenal when I was working in the technology team at an agency. That's a really powerful kind of sentiment to express. Along with, what if we inverted the time spent and spent the time at the end on the attention there. I'd have liked to have had that before. And you've been working in this industry for a long time. Are there little nuggets and things along the way that you've learned that you wish you'd had years ago? Are there particular things that you've learned more recently that you think my life would have been so much different if I'd just known this back when?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that I've learned, and I would say maybe this is just sort of a broad lesson of getting older and maybe growing up a little bit, is I don't have to do so much, and not everything has to be perfect. That there's like a lot of people around who are super competent, who things are easier when we work together. And so a lot of the things is, I don't have to be as precise with the work as I thought that I had to be. And part of it is that's especially true with the web, right, which is naturally an imprecise environment. So it's like we should go with the grain of that. But I think a big thing just that I wish that I had been kinder to myself about earlier is, you might be able to do better by doing less. And that's really sort of the spirit of what I'm talking about here. Is that a lot of things that we can do is, the people who are around us are often smarter and more capable than, frankly, we give them credit for,
Yeah.
or that we would suggest in terms of the kind of almost didactic instructions that we hand off.
The web is an imperfect, kind of unknown medium is definitely something that resonates with me. I feel like the things that you've been showing here really are the culmination of all of this attention initially on let's create pictures of websites and then make them perfect and agonize over them and then try and live up to that later on. And now with the kind of things that you're showing, it's like, well, you know what, we can change this process. We don't have to try and live up to an unrealistic picture of a website under these exact conditions. Understanding that it is a fluid medium, I think is just so critical. But I love the idea of be happy with doing less. I find it so hard though or I used to find it so hard to convince particular stakeholders that, I was going to say lower fidelity, but yeah, maybe that is the right expression. Lower fidelity visualizations of what they'll eventually get is fine at the early stages. I mean, you've done so much work in trying to shift that attention and trying to shift the way you express what you're going to deliver ultimately. Has that been very hard to convince stakeholders of that, so that they, that they're ready to go with the grain a little bit more? I mean, how has that worked out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've sort of created the expectation that the development is the hardest, most expensive part, and we should put that off until the last possible moment. And my experience instead is that by doing that, we wind up creating risk by saying the developers don't have enough time. And now they're crunched at the end of this roadmap timeline. They don't have enough time to build all the stuff that we promised. And so you don't get what you promised. So I think that the conversation there is, if you can wait a little bit more to see what this will look like, the overall risk and timeline is going to be lower because you'll actually be able to see it in the working product. And the point is sort of more like, it's not that we don't sort of suggest what things will look like or get in sort of the 70–80% close and we're going to finish it over here. It's not totally flying blind. But what it is doing is sort of saying, at this point, it's going to be actually easier for us to do the work in code than it will be for us to constantly iterate across 100 different comps of 100 different websites and keep all those things in sync. That's what code is good at. And so it's really a thing of being kind of like, of working with the stakeholders to be like, we are going to visualize this product, this end product, in the place where we can do that most quickly and closest to the product and save the most time. And everybody loves those things. It's like, I can make a comp today, or tomorrow I can show it to you what it looks like in the browser. What do you prefer?
Right.
It's like everyone will be like, browser, please, because then they can see it getting closer to the product. So ultimately, it's about managing risk. And I think that it's just like, it's a matter of shifting how we understand that risk.
I could not agree more. I think one of the things that people are trying to wrestle with is how this works for them in the environments that they're working in. One of the questions in the chat from Deborah was saying these recommendations sound great, and there's lots of enthusiasm about that. But typically, this works well in organizations where the designers and the developers are they're all together in-house, and maybe they're able to kind of talk more closely along the way. Does this work well for distributed teams, or teams where maybe not all of the disciplines are within the organization? You might be partnering with different organizations. Does the process still hold up and work in the same way, or are there different challenges, do you think?
Yeah, I understand the assumption that it would work better necessarily if you were in the same room. And sure, there's advantages to that. We all may be getting a little less from this experience here today than we would if we were all together in a certain place. There's friction that's introduced by distributed teams. But I've always worked in distributed teams. I've almost never worked in the same room with the teams that I work on. So it's not so much the distribution that is the matter, that can be sort of a problem. It's really about sort of expectations. And I think that that does come down to communication. So in terms of talking about working with a bunch of different people or at a difference or asynchronously, there is often that thing of being like, you know what, let me just put everything I know into one document so they no longer need me. We don't even have to communicate anymore. What can often be faster though, is it may be, and I've shared a few different techniques and a few different tools, but those aren't the only ones. And really the point is having a conversation with the person at the other end of it, which is sort of like, what's the least that you need from me to get the idea? And it could be, you know what, let's just have a 5-minute Skype call. I don't know where that came from. Hello, 2002. Anyway, I don't know. Right? Yeah, I guess so. I'm gonna AOL message you that.
Yeah.
Right. Or just, you know what, hold up a paper sketch to this of what you're talking about. The point is, whatever tool you're using, do the least possible in that tool for the developer to know what to do next. And then for the developer also to respond, because then that gives them more time to respond and be like, I see what you're going after. That doesn't really go with the grain of the framework we're using. What if we did it sort of this way? That would be a lot easier. And I think has the same effect. Whatever. You can start to have that glorious churn of collaboration that I was talking about, which if you soak it all up in a single document, you lose.
Yeah.
All of this is going to be different according to the person you're talking to. You know, if you have a team that's used to a certain thing, things can go faster. If you're new to somebody, you sort of have to learn. It's like, what do you need? I bet we can do this. I bet we can save a week if I don't do 10 page comps.
Yeah.
I think one last thing that I'll mention about this is it's not just about designer to developer thing. Sometimes it's like requirements too. So I've seen places, for example, that there's a page that has 15 different possible alert messages. And so the process is, all right, have the designer comp 15 different actual comps showing this stuff. And it's like, oh, Word document would be so much better, or even better, a JSON file that has whatever it is that's going to be sort of absorbing this. What's the thing that's actually going to be, it'd be so much faster. That stuff already came to them in a Word file somehow. Why does it have to wind up in a sketch file? That's a particularly egregious example, but we have all kinds of tools to share information, from whatever, simple Word documents or Jira tickets or GitHub issues. Use this. It's always a question of like, what's the thing that I can do fastest, most expressively, to get them what they need to do their work next?
Yeah. And I love the notion that it turns so much of the process into a conversation, right? Rather than a tape recording of some thoughts that you hand over and you say, right, go. I think so many more touch points it just creates so many more opportunities, and you discover things that you wouldn't have expected along the way, I guess, which I suppose really is one of the points. You mentioned, you know, you've always worked distributed, and so many more of us are doing now, you know.
Hello.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Luckily, I had somewhere I could work at home, so I'm all set. You know, a few of us are in that lucky situation, but certainly more people now are having to work at a distance. Do you have you seen? I mean, I know it's still early days, but have you seen over this time people's communications habits starting to change and their expectations about how you interact with them changing on projects like this? Because I guess you've been walking this path for a while and saying, well, look, we might be working at a distance, but we can collaborate in this way that breaks that distance down. Are you seeing that kind of permeate into places where it wasn't before, just because it's been forced on us a little bit?
Yeah. So I mean, it's been a little bit. You know, I think it's been a learning curve for a lot of folks. I think one thing that I'll say right off the top that I think has been wonderful about it is that I see a kind of compassion for everyone's individual circumstances as a result, that children and pets are part of every meeting now. And there's sort of like a real sense that of really knowing somebody, both who they are as well as the challenges that they're facing. I think, unfortunately, those burdens sometimes fall unequally on folks. I think that we see real challenges for women in the workforce who are taking on a really unfair amount of childcare in the middle of this when everyone's working at home. But I do think there's been something about the nature, the compassion of meeting people every day in their homes that changes things. But in terms of process, I think that there's also a shift that particularly for people with a lot of meeting cultures will continue to have conversations, but also do not want to be, on Zoom all the time, or Skype if they're still in 2002 with instant messenger. So what I do see is sort of a more of a thing of being sort of like, let me go off and put something together real quick for you, which I think is great, which is in tune with this. And then, let me, rather than sort of let me do a full blown thing and we'll have a giant meeting about it, more kind of informal, quick things, using things like Slack or Teams or things like that to get quick ideas and check-ins across that otherwise full meetings would have been in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I observe as well about a shift towards slightly more connected and I guess agile processes, and this regular delivery of, or regular contact and the regular delivery of things along the way through a project, is that they have a real impact on how people might expect to estimate how long a project's going to take or how much a project's going to cost. And there were some questions knocking around about estimations on here. So have you got any particular thoughts on or insights on how everyone loves talking about estimation, right? It's easy.
Obviously one of the hardest things, and it's still, obviously coding is called engineering, which it really is not. It bears so little resemblance to classic engineering, where it's like, we know how long it will take to build a bridge. We don't know how long it's going to take to build this software. We're always sort of wrong about that. The design process always is hard to estimate because it's like figuring out what we're going to make. That's always hard to estimate.
Yeah.
But if you can get to a gist of that, then you begin to have sort of a closer estimation. So if you can sort of get people on board of, yes, this is the right content to do. Yes, this is the proper functionality to do. Yeah, I can see we're 60% of the way toward visualizing how that will work. That begins to give you enough to estimate what the effort is. And then if you can reduce some of that further design work and churn and start to push the design process into development. So this is different. I'm not saying cut out design process. I'm saying do more design process in development. Push the designer into the front-end development phase, pull the developer into the design phase, so that we're pushing some of that typical production format forward into code. Now that's going to shift resourcing for sure, right? It means that developers are going to be hands-on a little bit longer. Overall, costs are going to be lower, timelines are shorter, but it is a different kind of estimating, and it's a different kind of resourcing. And frankly, also, you may find that there are also some developers or designers who aren't into it. And that's okay too, that there are sort of, as I mentioned, there's a role for designers to do spot comps, solve this part of the page, it's broken. And they don't have to go forward into code. And some developers are frankly not going to be interested in experimenting with the design process of what should we make, what should it do, how should it behave, and prefer to just receive the thing and kind of do that work, kind of copy what they receive. And there are moments for that too. So I'm not sort of saying that there's a one-size-fits-all process at all for design or for any individual thing. A lot of times it's about the chemistry of the two people who are communicating. What are you good at? How do you do it? In the same way that we adjust our conversation here. Like, I know that I can use my big fancy words with you, Phil. But, so it's like we adapt the way that we relate to people.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, that relates to another one of the questions that was in here, which is really just asking how suitable this is for different types and particularly different sizes of organization. I mean, do you find that a smaller, more agile with a lowercase a organization is more receptive to this, and bigger organizations are not? Or do you find that that doesn't really have an impact, and really, it is people all the way down?
I would say that the initial resistance typically comes from larger organizations, that we have a way to do this. Oh, that'll never work with them. I'm down for this, but those people aren't. You get a lot of that, right? It's sort of like this siloing that naturally happens in organizations, and the assumptions that everyone other than you is inflexible. What the reality is, though, is that you're rarely working with 1,000 people at once. Usually a project team is about the same size wherever you are for the stuff you're working on. It's still that, that handful of people usually. And so within that context, this stuff still works, where it's still kind of like I, as a designer, I'm working with 3 different developers. Let's figure out how to get you the information that you need so you can start building sooner than you otherwise would, understanding that I will be involved longer than I otherwise would.
Yeah. I once worked in a large organization at a point that they were starting to adopt some agile processes, and they really didn't like the notion, or some of the individuals didn't like the notion, that they wouldn't have a price and an estimate for when something would be done. And they would use this phrase. They'd say, agile is just making it up as you go along. And one of my colleagues there, a friend of mine, I don't know if this is attributed to him or if it was he got this wisdom from somewhere else, but I really liked it. He said, yes, agile is make it up as you go along. Waterfall, make it up before you start, live with the consequences. And I really like that kind of that little bit of kind of language judo to kind of just reflect on the fact that the way that we maybe once did these things was we just have to accept what we'd said before we knew things. Anyway, I just it came to mind as you were talking.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Is if you can get into the product sooner as you're building something, you have the option to say, you know what, it's good enough, let's ship it. Whereas if you wait and you wait and you wait, a lot of projects die before they even have a line of code written. That it's like the sponsorship, whatever happened, it's sort of like they look at it and they're like, yeah, we haven't even started yet, production yet, so forget it. If you get things in sooner, more stuff will see the light of day, because the reality is you'll be able to sort of say, we weren't able to take this as far as we wanted to, which is often the case, especially in larger company environments. But we got this far. This is good. Let's do it. So it gives you the option, at least. I recognize that it's less comfortable, but often just because it's less familiar. It seems like it's riskier. It reduces risk.
Yeah, totally agree.
And it's more fun.
It's way more fun
to work too.
Yeah,
because you're working with people. You're improving on each other's ideas. You're learning about how the system you're designing for works in the case of development. So many of us as designers make naive mistakes about what's hard or easy. We assume something's hard that's not. We assume something's easy that's not. When you're working closely with the developer, you can navigate those things before having that kind of familiar blow up. It's like, oh, well, this has already been approved by all the head honchos.
Right. So yeah, you have no say.
Boy, we're really screwed now. We can't go back.
Yeah, I'll get typing. Yeah. Just changing tack a tiny bit. So there's a question, again, just thinking about how this process and some of these ways of delivering things relate to how people are currently working. Pawan is saying, I've worked on many projects where prototypes were used for usability testing. And I guess that kind of suggests that they have to get to a certain kind of fidelity as a prototype before that can happen. And he's asking, where do you propose that would happen in the approach that you've been outlining? Have you got particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say that it's where can you do that prototype the fastest? Where are you in the process? And I think that there's an assumption that I have to use one of these sort of prototyping tools that sort of out there. It's like, oh, got you. But the truth is, it's like, where can you do it fastest? It's possible that you may be able to put something together more quickly, especially if you have a design system in the browser as a simple front end only kind of dumb prototype that still is interactive and works in the browser in the place where it will actually be, than it will be to sort of go off to the side and build something that is going to be throwaway. So I think that there's not a fixed question, but I think that the answer is always, where can I do this the fastest and closest to the product itself? And sometimes building a prototype will help to advance stuff. Part of the reason of building a prototype is to check, are we building the right thing?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the question is always, and this is the whole idea of lean UX as well, what's the least I can do to figure out if we're doing the right thing? But also there's a useful question to say, how can we test this while also moving the product forward? So there's sometimes a case to be made that's like, no matter what the UI looks like, we're going to have to build out this kind of foundational layer for the technology, whatever we're building, maybe this CSS frame, whatever. Perhaps by building the prototype, we can move this other part forward.
Mm.
So I think it's a little bit of a question of saying, where are we? What are the skills at hand, the resources available? And how can we create a facsimile of this thing without making a complete throwaway facsimile?
Yeah, wonderful. Josh, I think we're at the point that we should wrap up. We're kind of out of time. Thank you so much for talking to us. And I love the themes that are emerging here. Again, I wish I'd had them in my back pocket a few years ago, but that's life. I'm glad you're able to share all of these things with us and spare the time to have the conversation as well. So it's very, very much appreciated.
My pleasure. So good to see you, Phil. Take good care.
To see you looking fit and well. Another little ripple of gratitude, please, in the session chat. And oh, there we go. And over in Slack as well. Once again, big thanks, Josh. Ever so much appreciated.
Thanks. Take good care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.